Thank you, Kerry. Good afternoon, I think, from my side, and also thank you for everybody for making the time available to join us this morning or this afternoon. I'm going to talk about the divorce and deceased estate maintenance calculations. Now, there are many views on divorce. This is one of them. I really hope I don't ever have to get to know a man in that way, or a woman for that matter. And then on the agenda today, there's 6 points to cover. I'm not going to read them all. We'll address them as we get to each topic. Now, first of all, divorce and deceased estate maintenance calculations. Why do actuaries get involved? The simple reason is at times it's appropriate for the situation or for the parties involved to rather settle outstanding maintenance matters by a capital sum as opposed to having a lifelong obligation to pay a monthly or a weekly or an annual amount. Now, the basis of the liability for maintenance is normally represented by expenses that will be incurred by the parties. And for divorce matters, we don't really vet or audit any of the expenses that's being submitted to us. We do our calculation purely on instruction by the attorney. The reason being that there's normally, both parties really pay attention to what goes into the calculation, and if there's any disputes or any unreasonable items included in the calculation, the legal parties and the respective their clients normally sort it out, and the actuary's job is simply to quantify what's being agreed on. In deceased estate matters, however, things are a little bit different. We do our calculations in accordance with the Maintenance of Surviving Spouses Act, and the Act introduces a number of issues that need to be considered when you calculate or determine maintenance, and especially for a surviving spouse. On the Actuarial Society of South Africa side as well, there's been a professionalism requirement for actuaries to do the calculation according to the Act. There's been cases in the past where actuaries acted purely on instruction, and due to a lack of different people having a look at the information that's being used, there's been cases where, unfortunately, actuarial reports has been abused for a claimant to empty an estate to the detriment of other heirs and legatees. And so, to make sure that there's all parties are treated fairly, the actuary is required to reference the Act and attempt at least to do their calculation according to the Act. Now, briefly, just to understand valuing future expenses or any other cash flow items, but normally it's based on expenses. There's 3 elements to our calculation. The one is the probability that the future expense will be incurred, and that probability hinges mostly on being alive. So the probability that I'm going to buy groceries 5 years from now is very much dependent purely on me being alive 5 years from now. Then we also have to think, well, what's the groceries going to be costing 5 years from now? And for that, an appropriate inflation assumption needs to be made. And then the third element of the calculation is to say, well, to make sure I can afford my groceries 5 years from now, how much money do I need to put away today to be able to afford that? And that is what we call the interest on the investment return assumption. And that, combined with the inflation rate, gives us what we call a net discount rate. Now, firstly, mortality on our side is generally quite simple, or basically, at least most actuaries that operate in the damages arena are used the South African life tables, 84 to 86, life table 2. The reason we use 1984 to 1986 tables, which might seem a bit outdated, is in the subsequent census data and tables, the impact of HIV was disproportionate. That was before the rollout of ARVs, and therefore the life expectancy in our tables throughout the 90s were understated. The Actuarial Society is currently working on updated tables, but generally there's agreement that the 1984 to 86 tables are still the most appropriate. One of the questions we get asked often is, why not just calculate the expenses up to somebody's life expectancy? So say a person is currently age 70 and life expectancy is arguably to age 80. Often we see people trying to do their own calculation on the back of an envelope, and they go, well, they're going to be alive for the next 10 years. So therefore 10 years times the cost of groceries, that gives you a liability. But that is unfortunately an incorrect application of mortality. What we rather look at is the continuous probability of survival. So what we look at is to say, what is the probability that you will be alive for each possible future year of life? And we truncate that at age 100, simply because the probabilities beyond age 100 are so small that they do not have a material impact on the calculation. So we say, what is the probability that you'll be alive for each future year of life? And we times that probability with the expense that is to be incurred. Interesting thing with inflation, we often get a request for people to say, well, there isn't agreement yet on the expenses or the amount of maintenance. So let's do a simple calculation, 10,000 Rand a month increasing at CPI. And there is times where CPI, of course, can be appropriate, CPI being the consumer price index, which is the general measure of inflation. But it is worthwhile to remember that the average urbanite's inflation is not necessarily CPI. The CPI is representative of the broad population, the expense patterns there, and that's generally in the lower LSM categories. So if a person is in the higher LSM categories where we basically do most of our calculations, I think most people who live in urban areas can attest to the fact that their annual expenses the last decade or so hasn't been keeping track with inflation. And the concept of urban inflation is getting more attention. And the simple reason is there's certain items that increase by much more than CPI inflation, especially, for instance, medical aid, earnings if you employ people, and then there's also other items like electricity and food prices. At this point in time, we differentiate between price inflation, which is the broad CPI basket, earnings inflation, medical inflation, and medical insurance inflation. The difference between medical insurance and medical inflation is that medical inflation is actually the underlying cost of treatment or medicine, whereas medical insurance is the cost of medical aid, which has also the element of usage in it. It's still not perfect, but at least this differentiation between the four items gives a much closer answer to real inflation than just using CPI broadly. So we recommend for divorce maintenance cases, especially if possible, to rather give us an itemized expense list as opposed to sort of this global amount that we simply accrue at CPI, to rather go and say, well, X Rand for this item and Y Rand for that item. And here you can see graphically how severe the inflation risk can be. Now, medical aid or medical insurance is probably the worst example, but if you, and this is sort of actually quite the real world numbers, if your medical aid cost 1,000 Rand in January 2000, by March 2022, you would pay around 8,000 Rand for that same medical aid. Whereas if we had accrued that with CPI inflation, the answer would be just around 2,000 Rand. And you can see, and that's also something we've seen a lot with older people on fixed incomes, or whose incomes only increase with inflation, as that they start to spend a disproportionate amount of their income on medical insurance. And we try and avoid this situation arising by using an appropriate medical insurance inflation assumption. Then death, it's not something we like to talk about, but it's a part of life, so we might as well have a wry smile. And then, of course, there's the issue of preparation. And unfortunately, we often deal with situations where there's been inadequate preparation or inadequate assets being made available to surviving spouses or surviving children, and that's where we often get involved to calculate a fair maintenance amount that the deceased's estate is liable for. I'm going to go through this very quickly. I'd be very happy to take questions or for people to email us if they have questions. We can get into the detail, but very briefly, the Maintenance of Surviving Spouses Act, I show an excerpt from the act here. It's very specific about how it's calculated. So there isn't really for the actuary room to improvise. The act says you have to take into consideration the amount of in the estate and that's available to be distributed. So normally we request the liquidation and distribution account, but it's not always available. In cases where it's not available, we calculate whatever the maintenance is according to information provided to us, and then afterwards it might have to be adjusted proportionally so that the estate can afford the maintenance. Then importantly for the claimant, the existing and expected means, the earning capacity, any financial obligations they might have, and the subsistence of the marriage, and then also the standard of living and their age comes into play. And as discussed, the amount in the estate is basically the liquidation and distribution account, which we prefer to be furnished to ourselves if it's available. The expected means we provide onboarding documentation where we request that all assets and liabilities are being listed. We also take consideration of complicated assets or rights, for example, trusts where it's not necessarily predictable how much somebody will benefit from a trust, but then we make assumptions that we deem reasonable. We also look at future proceeds from insurance and pension that's not been paid yet, either from the deceased or from the surviving spouse. And then lastly, some assets are appropriate to exclude, but we request a full list and we will apply judgment as to what needs to be excluded. For instance, vehicles and homes are assets that's needed to live, and therefore they're not available to meet maintenance requirements. On the earnings capacity side, we normally look at if the surviving spouse is employed and also at their age and qualification and potential earnings, and we do quantification of earning capacity on that basis. And we also have a rich reservoir of experience in that field because we do a lot of that for road accident fund claims. So we have a large database to refer to make sure we do an appropriate calculation. The financial needs and obligations are normally represented by the expenses submitted to us, but some expenses needs to be excluded because the estate is not liable. So for instance, we get items that, contributions is being made to Uncle Sam every month by the surviving spouse. Now the deceased estate is not necessarily liable to maintain Uncle Sam, so those type of expenses are sometimes excluded. On the subsistence of the marriage, we note that that's not really an actuarial consideration because there's simply no way to translate the term of a marriage into data. But we note the term in our report, and that's more a legal argument as to whether or not the maintenance amount should be adjusted, I presume, if the marriage has been of a very short duration. And standard of living and age, finally, and that is an important part of the process because we often get people overclaiming. I guess there's an element of fear or sometimes maybe an element of greed where people want to empty the estate, and we look at the deceased and the surviving spouse's means and especially their earnings to look at what would have been a reasonable expenditure to maintain their lifestyle. And if we feel the claimant is claiming too much, we won't necessarily adjust it, but we will note it in the report, and the executor of the estate and the master of the High Court might have to address that. Children is similar to spouses, but the duty is simpler in the sense that kids don't really have, generally have means or income or assets and investments. So it's most of the time basically a quantification of future expenses. We recommend that even if a surviving spouse and a child is claiming for maintenance from a deceased estate, that we do separate calculations. From experience, we've learned that children's claims are often not disputed and granted far quicker to simplify matters. And therefore, if you do a separate calculation for the child and you submit a separate report, at least that part of a maintenance claim is normally settled far quicker than spousal maintenance, which is often disputed by other heirs and heirs and legatees. For children, it's worth noting that mortality is small, and especially if a child's maintenance is only for a year or 2 or 3, your interest impact is also small, and then often a pragmatic solution is to simply add up expenses for that time period. But for younger children, actuarial calculation certainly adds value. There's also tertiary education, so sometimes maintenance is payable until age 21 or 24, and then mortality does start to play a bigger role. In terms of apportionment, the Act states that spouses are responsible to maintain children according to their respective means, so there might have to be an apportionment issue or apportionment applied. That very rarely features on the actuarial side. It's mostly something that we calculate the child's maintenance need, and then afterwards the parties involved decide how to split it. We occasionally have a situation, especially where there's a spouse and the ex-spouse, and there's disagreement about how much each spouse is liable for the respective children's maintenance, that we do an assessment of incomes and do a comparative analysis and to see what each person can afford, what the estate can afford, and how to apportion that in a fair and equitable basis. Other calculations that we deal with also in the sphere of divorce and deceased estates is accrual and living annuity calculations. Now, the living annuity calculation is often a subset of either deceased estate maintenance claim or accrual calculation. Firstly, accrual is the calculation is required where a couple has been married outside of community of property with accrual. And the accrual calculation is a fairly simple calculation on our side, but it is important that it is done correctly. If it's done incorrectly, the financial impact of the accrual can be significant. The information or what we determine is the estate's as at the date of marriage, and that's normally stated in the antenuptial contract, so we require that documentation. We have to adjust it for CPI inflation until the date of dissolution of the marriage. We have to look at the estate's as at the date of the dissolution of the marriage, and also need to be informed if there's any items that needs to be excluded, for instance, inheritance or lottery winnings. And then the real increase in the combined estate, so the inflation adjusted increase in the combined estates, is apportioned between the parties in a fair manner. Often to determine the estate of a person, if they have a living annuity as an asset, one has to value the living annuity. Now, in times past, because of the technicality that the underlying assets of a living annuity is owned by the life insurer, they were often excluded from the estate of a person. And I'm sure you can imagine that there's all sorts of shenanigans around that, because if somebody had a retirement fund and they were planning on getting divorced, they would move the monies into a living annuity, and suddenly that doesn't form part of the estate anymore. And the judiciary and the law recognized that problems, and the Montanari judgment, Montanari versus Montanari, Mr. Montanari had a couple of living annuities, and the judgment recognized that he is not the owner of the underlying assets, so including his living annuity at the price of the underlying market values of the assets wasn't a solution, wasn't a fair solution, because he didn't have access to that assets. The only right he had was to draw down on income from those assets. And the court ruled, well, that income should be valued. And obviously you pay tax on your income that you draw from your retirement or your living annuity. But there is an element of complexity as well, in that annually on the date of the anniversary of the policy, you can change the amount that you draw down, represented by a drawdown rate. Now, the law specifies that you can draw down somewhere between 2.5% and 17.5% per year of the underlying asset value, and you can change that percentage every year within those parameters. And so the difficulty is, if a living annuity is getting valued, on the one extreme, if the person is drawing down at the lowest possible value of 2.5%, then valuing it at that income, the other party would be prejudiced, because you can next year go and start drawing down at 5 or 10 or 15%. On the other extreme, on the 17.5% valuation side, it often gives an answer that's not realistic in the sense that you pay much higher income tax, so the overall value is being reduced on a proportionate basis, and also it's unreasonable often for a policyholder to draw down at the highest level. So what we typically do is we do 3 or 4 scenarios where we calculate the values of the living annuity at the highest drawdown, the lowest drawdown, the actual current drawdown rate adjusted for inflation, and also the midpoint drawdown rate. That gives the legal parties and the parties involved a range of values that are all possibilities. And then it's a matter of negotiation or court ruling between the parties to agree on what percentage of each value or what value to use as the fairest to all parties involved. So if you would like to instruct us on living annuity, accrual calculation, deceased estate, maintenance calculation, or divorce calculation, please send us an email at actuary@munro.fa. We'll let you know what we need from our side and also send you the onboarding documentation. And once we've received the information, we will review it and provide you with a quote. I thank you very much. I want to check if there's any questions at this point in time. Alternatively, you are welcome to email me at actuary@munrofa.com. Please address it to Willem if there's any questions, or give us a call. I'd be happy to discuss any questions you might have.
Hi, Willem. This is Jaco Jansen from PE speaking.
Hello, Jaco.
Willem, I'm trying to multitask actually between the session and work, so I apologize if you have to repeat yourself. I noted on one of the slides the concept of urban inflation. Do you mind just touching on that just briefly and just explain the difference between urban and normal inflation?
Yeah, sure, Jaco. So I think it's maybe Mike Schuessler who coined the phrase urban inflation, but the terminology has been around for a while. And that's recognized that your sort of middle income to higher income earning families, their inflation experience in the real world is often higher than CPI inflation. And that's because the CPI inflation basket is representative of the broad population's spending patterns. And because the majority of South Africa's population is in the lower income categories, or even given the scale of unemployment in the no income category, your average South African spends more money on basic goods and services and low cost goods and services. Whereas your middle income family, their buying habits are different. They buy different food, buy different groceries. They'll spend more on electricity, will spend more on petrol. Only a small portion of the population have medical aid, so only a small part of the population actually incurs medical aid inflation. And so all those spending patterns actually result in the middle and higher income families having higher actual inflation than CPI or price inflation. And the way we deal with it is we allow for 4 categories of inflation in our calculations, and we encourage people to rather give us sort of an itemized list of expenses so that we can apply the appropriate inflation to each item, as opposed to giving us a global amount that we have to simply inflate at CPI inflation.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, I thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to hand over now again to Kerry. Thank you.
So now that Willem's finished with the divorce and deceased estates information, I'm going to hand over to Ashley, another one of our brains behind the operation, to assist with some medical costs. So I'm going to hand over to Ashley to do his introduction, and he will then get on the way. I hope you guys are enjoying the presentation, and then I'll touch back with you a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Maruma, and I'll be presenting on future costs. So basically, a little bit about myself. I play soccer 3 times a week, and I actually injured one of my legs. So I'm technically playing on one leg, but yes. So I've been working at MFA for about 4 years now. Yes, so I've been here for quite a while. I've seen a couple of IP reports, a lot of medical expert reports. So yeah, hopefully this session will help us into understanding better how we can get the correct information so that we don't undervalue any claims, and the information that we get sometimes can be quite poor. So basically what we're trying to do is we're getting this alignment between ourselves and the medical experts. So without wasting any further time, basically, I'm not going to read everything, but we will be speaking about future costs in terms of inflation, capitalization, mortality, and later on I'll be talking about joint minutes, and yeah, you will see as we go. I'd prefer that we save all our questions for the end of the session so that we can be able to proceed smoothly, and we'll answer the questions later on. So basically, we deal with loss of earnings, loss of support, and future cost. It's just in particular today, I'll just be looking at future costs. And with future cost, we have inflation. So basically the concept of inflation is when we speak about $1,000 in 2018, we know that it's worth more now. So for instance, just looking at your household stuff, back in 2009, somewhere there, I used to use like 10 rands to get to town in Limpopo, but now you can't actually do anything. For instance, bread was also 4 rands at some point in time back in the past, but nowadays you can't actually do much with 4 rands. So that's how the time value of money operates. It works like that. So basically 1,000 today is not gonna have the same buying power as 1,000 next year. So that's what we call inflation. So the next thing is capitalization. Capitalization of cost is actually one difficult concept. So I'm going to try to simplify it as much as I can. So basically it's the simple calculation where there are 3 processes involved. So the first process that's involved is salary inflation. So basically we inflate whatever amount with inflation, and then what we do is we have to decrease it with interest. And after decreasing it with interest, we can use the net discounting rate to get the present value of how much that thing is today. So basically, if we are assuming 6% interest rate, inflation, 6% inflation, if the price of a t-shirt today is $100 and we use 6% inflation, it means next year it will be worth $106, right? But what we need to do is we need to reduce that 106 rands with the interest so that we can find out how much we need today in order to be able to buy that shirt next year. That's the concept of inflation. That means we inflated it by 6%. However, we would need to spend 97 rands today and invest it so that we can be able to afford it at 106 next year. So if you have questions about this, I'm happy to address them later, but the concept is simple like that. You just add 6% to the 100 rands and then it's 106 next year. However, we would need to decrease that by the 8.65% so that it is reduced to what we need to invest today in order for us to get that 106% next year. So yeah, that's basically the concept of it, and that's what capitalization is. So if you just understand this concept, it's actually easier to understand. So basically capitalization comes in the form of, sometimes they speak about a future cost, and that future cost is worth $1,000 in the future. Let's say they give us in 2 years. So what we would do is we would have to reduce it by the interest rate so that we know how much it would cost today. That's why sometimes people, attorneys think we've undervalued the claim, but we actually haven't undervalued the claim. It's because of the time value of money, interest, and inflation that the amount today is lower than it would be tomorrow. So that's basically why. So yeah, capitalization is the most interesting thing that you have to look at in terms of costs, because of it answers questions like, why is this lower than the amount on the report? The reason it's lower is because we adjusted for inflation and interest, and furthermore, we looked at the net discount rate. So moving on, we're going to look at mortality. So most of my colleagues in the sessions before, they've actually explained this. So I'm just going to touch on it a bit because it's also important when we're doing calculating the future cost. So basically, the way we look at mortality is basically you have a greater chance of living until tomorrow than you have a greater chance of living until 3 years later. So that's basically mortality. Or you can look at 6 months. Even if you look at the next 2 days, you have a greater chance of living until tomorrow than you do until living until Sunday. So that's what mortality is. Basically, we look at the probability of survival in each month, and then we do that and we multiply it by the after-tax monthly amount so that we can get the probability that you survive until that point. So the other example that Willem made was that we don't look at the life expectancy. We actually look at the sum of the probability of you living each month until you get to the age of retirement. That's why we can't exactly just calculate until that life expectancy. So basically, a nice, interesting example here is if you have 2 individuals, one being male, one being female, and everything else is the same. They have the same age, they have the same cost story, they have the same calculation. What the lump sum of the woman is going to be higher than the man, because we need gender and age in order to calculate the mortality. So the reason the woman will have a higher loss or a higher capital value than the man is because generally women have a higher life expectancy than men. So basically the mortality of men is higher than the mortality of the women. So that's why if you've ever wondered why women live longer, that's your reason there. And next, basically, if an expert mentions reduced life expectancy, basically, let's say they just say the life expectancy is reduced by 10%. What we would do is we apply it to the monthly life expectancy such that the entire total of the person's life expectancy is reduced by the 10%. That's what it actually means by a 10% reduction in life expectancy. And then furthermore, so now we can look at the lump sum. So this lump sum actually also shows you the impact of inflation, interest, and mortality. So basically that 1,000 that I mentioned in a few slides back in 2018, we can see here that in 2019, it's actually higher. It's higher than the 1,000. But towards the end, which is closer to retirement for this person, it's actually now getting lower. The reason it's actually getting lower at that point is because they are closer to retirement, which means they have a higher mortality. Like I said, you have a higher probability of living until tomorrow, and it should be higher than the probability of you living until you are 65 years. That's why at that point you can see the amount there is almost half because of the mortality that we are taking into account. This also goes back into why some future values are actually lower today than they are in the cost report, in the expert report, is because of exactly this. So after we take into account inflation and interest, we look at mortality. So the mortality at that point will be lower, which is why this person, this 1,000 here, looks lower than the one today. That's exactly what the reason is. And then next, we look at basically what is required for us to calculate future costs. So what we need is the item description and the example. So basically what we need is the cost. So what is the cost? And then the description of the cost in this case is the recommendation that is recommended for the cost. And we actually need the amount. The amount is also very important, and we need the quantity. And we also need the frequency, the date, and the age. So basically for one complete cost, for us to be able to calculate that cost, it should give us basically what the amount is, what the quantity is, what the frequency is, and what the date is. So these are 5 quite important things, and we're gonna go through a couple of examples as to why this is very important. But before we get into that, basically, I'm gonna speak about Ntombela. So I'm not gonna read all of this, but these are actually the points to show you what a complete joint minute should look like. So basically, there's a joint minute that's acceptable, and as per the Gauteng Practice Directive, these are the pointers that they gave up so that you know this is a joint minute that is acceptable. So if you had a joint minute and it doesn't meet these categories, you can easily send it back to the expert and be like, look, you didn't give us all the information that we require. These are the standards that it would have to meet. So moving on, the reason joint minutes are very important is there could be multiple differences between the experts, and the reason they're important is because we use them for settlements. So if the joint minute doesn't meet the Ntombela, it doesn't meet those specifications, what actually ends up happening is there will be more confusion. Basically, it's taking us back. We're trying to get this settled. We're trying to make sure that everything is clarified. But then because of that, there will be multiple confusion. There's no clarity. There will be more costs than actually is necessary because now they were not in agreement about what they want us to do and so forth. So basically, that's why this is very important. And the common problems that we usually meet is that the recommendations are not mentioned. So basically, there will be some recommendations that are important for this client to be able to have a better life and trying to put them in a better position, but then they don't give us all the recommendations. And the costs are not actually specific enough for us to be able to calculate it. So it's a bit vague. And the reason I'm mentioning this is sometimes we are asked by attorneys, why didn't you calculate this cost? Why didn't you do that? So the reason we don't do that is because all the costs that are in the expert report, they're not specific enough for us to be able to calculate. And furthermore, some of these costs, they agree on the treatment, but the details of the treatment, they actually differ. And then now we don't actually know which way to go about, you know. So, and then the other thing is they'll give you like multiple options for one treatment that is there. So basically, this actually causes the number of costs to increase, which actually increases the cost of the report itself, and it gives us more confusion when we should be getting a settlement and trying to work towards a solution. It brings about more confusion. So which is why we're having this conversation. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples as to what these things that I'm mentioning here mean. So the first one I'm going to talk about is missing costs. So here, it's just an example of a particular doctor. I'm just going to read the first one. Basically, that doctor is talking about affected muscles, and they're saying provision should be made. But we don't know how much needs to be for those things. So that's the thing I was talking about. So going back to that slide that I mentioned, that it should look like this. It should have the cost, the amount, the quantity, the frequency, the date, and the age. So in this instance, here, they actually didn't give us the cost. So the cost is missing. And the next example I'm going to talk about is when the price is missing. If you check the first two, I took the liberty of just showing you the first two. The first two is fine because they talk about it's 30,000 per month, and they tell you as he ages, and then they tell you the transport is going to be 240 per annum. But here we see two costs where they actually didn't give us the quantity. No, it's actually the price, excuse me. They didn't give us the price. They said building construction, this person must have a ramp at home and a bathroom, and then they said a wheelchair. But they didn't tell us how much that wheelchair is. They didn't tell us how much the building construction is going to cost. So basically, the prices are missing there. And the other thing I'm going to look at is missing quantity. So basically here, they say the cost of each major pressure sore is in the region of 180. But you could ask yourself, how many pressure sores are going to be there? That's the other thing. So we usually assume one, but that one, it doesn't actually tell us the whole truth. We assume one because there is a cost. So now it's going to look like we've actually undervalued it. Whereas if they had told us this person will need major pressure sores, about 3 in their whole life, or they could say 1 per year for the next 3 years. So that actually gives us the quantity of how much we need to allow for. And then here they speak about the outpatient therapy. However, they don't tell us the number that needs to be for those things. So they're not actually being specific. And then they're telling us about their transport cost, but they're not telling us the kilometers that they need to travel and everything. So the quantity is missing. So these are just the examples of why sometimes we are not able to calculate particular costs because of the information that we get is not enough or sufficient enough for us to be able to give you a calculation. And the other one is the missing frequency. And then here, it's basically this treatment. If you look at this treatment, it just says 1 consultation. So, but it doesn't actually tell us the frequency of how many consultations are going to be there. And then if you see here, it just says toiletries need to be replaced at 150. It doesn't tell us, okay, how many, this 850, is it going to be per year? Are they going to need toiletries per month? Are they going to, so the frequency of when this is needed is not said. Because here, for the treatment of the infection, they just say 450, but they're not actually telling us that it's 450 per week, it's 450 per year. So those are some of the things that make it hard for us to be able to calculate this. And then there will be this back and forth between us and the attorney. We're calling you, look, we see this cost, they speak about toiletries. Like for instance, usually our assumption would go with 1. So we'll just allow for that once off. But realistically speaking, we all know that you can't have toiletries of 850 once off for your entire life. No, in fact, some people do this per week, some people do it per month. That's why the frequency is also quite important. If you just continue to think back to that table that I gave, that shows you what we need in order for something to be complete. And then the other one is missing dates or ages. So for instance, this expert here is saying that the child in more mature years, this is going to happen. We don't know what more mature years mean. Like there's no assumption for us to make there. And then here it's speaking about the pediatric shower chair, adult shower chair. So it says 4 to 5 years and 8 to 10 years, but there are ages that are missing there. So there's like a transition in between that was not accounted for. So we also need that. So there's a missing date and missing ages in order for us to do that transition. Furthermore, here it speaks about the child will need this cost until they are 36 kilograms. But we don't actually know when this child will be 36 kilograms. So those are some of the missing information that make it hard for us to do these costs. And the main thing what we're trying to do is be in alignment so that we can be able to calculate these costs without any issues, which is why the last one, actually, before I get into our template, the last one I wanted to mention as well is there will be multiple costs. So if you look at these costs, they speak about psychotherapy. So psychotherapy. This is like the same cost, but they actually giving multiple costs for that same thing. The description is the same. This one says 790, this one says 550. They go furthermore and say 840. So what this actually does is it ends up making us calculate multiple costs for the same thing, and there will be duplications. So, which is also kind of showing the importance of joint minutes. If they had a joint minute, they could have both agreed that, okay, look, we're going to propose 6 private physiotherapy practices, and that's it. And then they agree on 790 as the price of it. And then in that way, we are able to proceed. But if it's like this, it prolongs the whole calculation and we do multiple things, right? And those were just like some of the issues that we meet. And at the end, I'm going to just share with you one of our nice templates that we created here so that we can all be in alignment, so that you guys can understand what is needed for us to have a cost. But that table that I presented on a couple of slides back actually shows you what is required, the amount, the frequency, and like, you know, all of those things. How often do we need it, the quantity, the price, and everything. So now, this one is also very important. What we do is there's usually a lot of experts who actually comment on life expectancy. But what they do is they just make a comment. They don't actually follow the proper approach or calculation. So essentially what we're trying to say is we would prefer if we have a life expectancy expert report, and they are the ones that actually can comment on it. And alternatively, what we can do is the attorney can instruct us on the life expectancy. And now, specifically, when we're speaking about cerebral palsy patients, CP patients, their life expectancy is almost always reduced. So if we get the life expectancy expert report, we'll be able to calculate it and reduce it. However, if the attorney is going to instruct us on that, they would actually need to include the feeding method and the mobility for these CP patients. So basically, the easiest way for us to go about this is for us to have life expectancy experts to make the comments on these life expectancy changes and everything. So that's preferable. And then now back to that template that I showed you guys about. So this is basically the template that we formulated here at Munro. So it actually clearly shows what we need. We need the report, who did the report, and the description of the cost, and basically the amount, the number of times, the frequency, and the timing and the duration of everything. And the date of birth, gender, and everything is important because this is what we use in order to look at mortality. The reason the report's dates are actually important is because of the time value of money that I mentioned previously. So what it does is it tells us that this amount, even if it was 1,000 in 2012, we'll be able to calculate how much it would be today, how much it would be tomorrow. So it's for the time value of money. So basically this template, it summarizes the costs, and you can clearly see when there's missing information, and you can actually call the expert and be like, look, this is missing. And there won't be any misinterpretations because it's quite clear what is required. There won't be any conflicting information because we will know exactly what's needed. And also we offer a nice deal for those who use the template. So basically it's cheaper for you as the client to be able to, if you're using this, instead of giving us 800 pages of perusal for us to be able to extract these costs. So that's why that's also important. So at the end, we can, for those who want the template, we'll actually share it with you so that you can use the template and help us make your life easier by making our life easier.
Thank you, Ashley. That was awesome. And yeah, if anybody's got any questions, I'll give you a chance to speak up or write them in the chat. And Ashley will answer them, and I'll hand back to him shortly for those questions. So like Ashley said, we can share the template with you. So what I'm going to do is I've just popped it into the chat. You're most welcome to go and have a look on our website. It is there under client resources. So you're most welcome to download it from our website. Alternatively, like you've heard me speak about all of last week and this week, you can get it on Connect also. So while saying that, I am going to quickly share my screen, Ashley, if you don't mind. And then again, I'm going to just present the Connect screen to you guys. So you would be able to, can you see my screen? Awesome. So what would happen is you would be able to go onto Connect and under the new instructions module, choose medical negligence, and the template will also be available there for you guys to download. So everything will be there. So if you guys have any other questions, I'm going to hand you over to Ashley. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us through this series. It's been great having you. I hope you've learned a lot. I've learned a lot, definitely. So thank you guys for joining us, and thank you to all the presenters. It's absolutely been amazing.